you, Ed. There's definitely some time for questions, but let's first of all get Ed a hand, and then we'll move on to questions. Thank you, Ed. I know questions may be coming forward. I have one for you. In the audience today, there are many VOS aspirants and at least 4 recipients. Can you tell the iSchool community more about the future of this program?
Jose Maria, it was very distorted at the beginning. Can you just say it again, the question?
Yeah. Can you tell people more about the VOS program, VOSS program?
Right, okay. So, yeah, the VOS program is relatively small at the level of a couple of $1 million right now. It has a number of awards. Well, I think that's just the funding from OCI, so it may be larger than that actually altogether. Now, I've forgotten the exact figure. But it's done largely with the SBE Directorate, so there are strong partners in this. And it's really aimed at studying existing virtual organizations to figure out how they work, where they don't work, what their needs are, particularly as we go forward in this more comprehensive cyber infrastructure world that I'm talking about. So there are currently a number of awards that you can get abstracts of on the NSF Fastlane website, but the program is currently being reissued, and so it will be very similar to the current call for proposals that'll be coming out in the next couple of months. So there'll be another round that you should be able to apply to sometime over the summer.
Thank you. Now, I have quite a long question, so can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
All right, so the next person says, thank you for your talk. At one point, you said that data was the fundamental challenge with respect to cyber infrastructure. Of course, data is not God-given nor neutral. It can be contested, ambiguous, messy, unclear, where it comes from, etc. Data is inextricably linked to the methodologies and tools which are inextricably linked to theories, worldviews, perspectives, and agendas. Metadata is important, as is interpretation and context. So the questions. As a backdrop against which we do and understand science, how can cyber infrastructure address these meta-challenges that arise naturally from distributed collaborations across fields, disciplines, and cultures? That's the first question. I'll stop there.
Well,
a grand question.
I'm laughing because we have a task force addressing that particular question. I'm smiling because we're struggling with all of these issues. I can only say that I identify with every single one of these issues. It's a big, tremendous struggle for us in every discipline, whether it's data that are collected from experiments or from communities where there could be a lot of uncertainties in the data, to the data that are generated by the simulation community. So just to give you an example, in my own community, in the simulation community, it's not just astrophysics, but anybody who simulates things on a supercomputer, you have to develop codes. And of course, the codes are being changed all the time. And yet no one really has a handle on how to keep records of exactly what version of a code you used, especially if it was contributed to by multiple people in the community, as we're encouraging people to do. And so then you get a result. And unless you have very, very good records of everything, it's probably impossible to actually reproduce that result. And so that's just one example where the data in some sense are clean because they're all computer generated, and yet they're very dirty in the sense that we don't understand the provenance of all the source code, or actually the complete state of how the modules would have worked together, and so on. And so these are huge issues. The metadata is something describing the data that most of the science communities barely even know what the word means, quite honestly. And so there's a lot of education that has to be done there as well. I know there's still a culture, even in my own simulation community that I keep coming back to, where there's still the attitude that the hard part is the science, and I'll just let my student code this up and then they'll run this on a supercomputer and get the answer out. So that's another area where the metadata describing the codes and the input variables and so on are not understood at all in terms of the training that's needed that goes into this. And so just in that one area alone, we have a huge challenge ahead of us. And so when you bring in all these other areas, I can only say that it is just a huge challenge. But the DataNet program in particular is really struggling with that very deeply. And so that's why I was saying it's the biggest challenge, because we do have all of those problems and we don't really have good answers to them yet.
Ed, I have a question for your technical support team, and we've been asked at this end whether at your end somebody could switch the camera to show you, because we've got a summary of your slides right now, so it would be nice for people to see you at this point, just when they can. So I'll go on. I'll go ahead and ask you another question, and it's actually the second part of that, which is about context. How do you deal with context that's difficult to capture or really just can't be captured as data or metadata, and how can cyber infrastructure support collaboration at a level of interchange higher than data, at a higher level than just the data level? You got thoughts on that?
I'm not quite sure. I think you mean at the level of the context, so the metadata describing things, for example. How do you know where there's even a kind of a logical match between things, for example, about whether the context matches between the different data sets or something like that. I'm not sure. You can't really go back to the question very easily.
It's so hard, but maybe I'll have somebody email you with more details. Okay, let me ask you.
I can't give a good answer on that one.
Okay. Yeah, we did get. I believe we can share your slides. Am I correct? Yeah, we'll be sharing the slides through the site. Should curating a data or analysis script collection be a primary academic publication on par with journals and conferences?
I have a lot to say about that. I think, yes, I think we need to find ways to do this, or else people will not feel that they're getting credit for their intellectual activity in terms of the data collections. Data collections, and by that I mean very broad things. For example, software environments also is a sort of a data collection. That if things could be peer-reviewed and people can get credit for these things, they can be cited, that will provide a lot more motivation to actually providing open data so that people can share things. I have a lot of, this leads into many discussions on open access, whether it's about publications or the data themselves that people are collecting, or the software environments. One overlooked aspect in the spectrum of data are software environments. When people develop a code, can they share it? Can they get credit for developing? Could the code be peer-reviewed? If you publish a theorem, of course, you have to provide all the actual steps in it or people won't believe it. But if you do a numerical simulation, typically people don't provide the code or the input stacks that went into the code, and therefore people are very skeptical of them. And so it would be nice if we could link all of these things to publications of some kind that actually have peer review, and new versions could be thought of as sort of new publications and so on. So I'd like very much to see if we can move communities towards a good mechanism for doing these things. So that's an important question, certainly.
Another question on a different topic. You visited EU institutions. Did you reach agreement on priorities in cooperation between EU Science Foundation agencies and NSF in the United States?
Well, I would say we reached agreement on areas we do want to work together on. Let me give you some examples. So, for example, in DataNet, we talked to people specifically in the European Commission about this, and so we are having discussions on whether at some point we could have additional nodes to a DataNet program that were cooperating and even provided metadata, for example, that were compatible, so we could describe things that were needed by communities that really span the continents, and they have different data collections, but they would like to be able to share them. So we're having specific discussions on those areas. Another area that we had a lot of enthusiasm for is in the high-end computing area. We have a huge problem, although I tried to make it sound easy compared to the data area. It's actually still a very hard problem. What are the software environments that we need for high-end computing? Well, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Americans typically all buy computers from the same companies, and we don't have tools that really can be used to support our communities. The companies can't develop them by themselves. And so we're toying with the idea of, could we have a more global alignment of research programs and developing tools for high-end computing that would involve multiple agencies on multiple continents with the vendors and the scientific communities cooperating more closely, because we all have limited funding, so we could make it more coherent, we'd have more impact. So the data area, also interoperability of data. We have a small program at NSF in my office called Interop, which aims at making different data collections to be interoperable with each other. It's more on the interfaces and the sort of the semantics that describe things in the metadata, sort of aligning that between different communities. So within the European Commission, there was a lot of interest in that. So those are the two primary areas where we made already some progress in discussions.
Okay, thank you. In your presentation, you talked about the role of government agencies, particularly NSF, and the role of academe. What do you feel about the role of business in this future cyber infrastructure? It's
critical. So we are fortunate to have people from industry on our advisory board for cyber infrastructure at NSF. In particular, Microsoft and Google are represented. But we have dialogues with many companies, and I think we need clearly to work more closely together. Not only do we provide the basic research that goes into the companies that's often then taken and taken to a more applied level, but we have a lot of common interests, and in particular, there's the issue of sustainability. And when it comes particularly to software, for example, we would like to think, are there mechanisms where the academic research community that's actually not very good at developing professional level software could somehow partner with appropriate industry connections to take software and make it more sustainable. And so there could be ways where we learn from their best practices of software engineering, or there could be ways where we can hand things off at some level, but those are difficult discussions because it costs a lot of money to take something from an academic level prototype, works pretty well, to an actual commercial level. And so anyway, the answer is yes, but the details are difficult to work out.
Thank you. Another question, how do you distinguish between computational science, information science, computer science, and archive management objectives in the OCI program?
Okay. So the first thing I would just say is I see computational science more clearly in how it relates to computer science. In my view, it's more like applied math and math. And I've seen struggles within departments in many universities where say a math department has a group of applied mathematicians. They grow to a level where they become increasingly frustrated with their home department. They may break off and create their own department or something like that, but they still depend fundamentally on the on the fundamental, more pure mathematicians. And so I think computational science, and I think cyber infrastructure is kind of like the tangible output of computational science activities, is kind of going through that sort of growing pains with the computer science community right now. And I think information science is kind of, there's a Venn diagram that somehow overlaps with computational science, computer science, and information science, at least the way I see that. In terms of the data archiving and management activities, I'm not quite sure what was meant there, but it seems to fall somehow in the information and computational science groups. So there's a lot of overlap there. But I'd like to understand better your perspectives on what are the right organizational structures within universities really support the growth of those areas. Right now, I think that they're going through some pretty tough growing pains.
Well, I think one of the things we might like to do, Ed, is have you come and sit down with the iSchool deans and have an interesting conversation that takes this somewhat further. I know we're sort of asking you to come to have the solution to our problems, and you're asking us to help you with the solutions to your problems. But a couple
the same problem.
Well, that's right. A couple more questions. It was a great observation that innovation happens at the fringes. However, the fringe developments are at odds with the push toward grand challenges. Computing is everywhere, and the fringe innovations will often come from non-CS disciplines, so sociology, anthropology, design, etc. So the question is, why not fund a greater number of projects at smaller amounts to discover innovation that would be overlooked by grand challenges?
Okay. Well, I think we need to do both of those kind of things. So, for example, one thing that I'm toying with here is the idea of, could we seed smaller scale collaborations where we just want to look for interdisciplinary research, and so from my point of view it would be enabled somehow by cyber infrastructure, but this is going on across the foundation, and then we could do a larger number of those things and kind of troll the waters that we stir up with those and then see what comes out, but at the same time to figure out how those could lead to some of the grand challenges. So the one thing about the grand challenges, I've been in two different ones, one in the US that was very difficult, the Black Hole Grand Challenge, and then one in Europe where I kind of learned some lessons from that earlier program. The Black Hole Grand Challenge is more like a monolithic project where people fit together into a larger machine to solve the two black hole problem, and the people didn't like the sociology of that very much because it was rather rigid. So in Europe, kind of learning from that, we tried to develop more self-sustaining groups that were smaller, but they all had an awareness of the fact that they were contributing to the bigger picture. And so you had more ability for the individual groups to kind of blossom themselves, but always thinking of how they interacted in the bigger picture. And that worked pretty well. So that's a little bit of the philosophy of what I think I'm hearing in that question as well. So that resonates with me.
Questions. You talked about the need for organizational restructuring in academic colleges and iSchools. Do you have any particular structure in mind? And if so, we'd all like to know.
I've seen a lot of examples of the difficulties here. I think there are different models that can work. So some of you know that I built this center in Louisiana called the Center for Computation and Technology that was inherently multidisciplinary, or still is, and it's still going on. The model there was we had 50-50 appointments that were joint with the different departments. In fact, as of last count, we had joint appointments with 13 different 13 different departments in, I think, 5 different colleges, from business to the School of Music to basic sciences, engineering, and so on. In some cases, those worked pretty well. In other cases, they were rather difficult because the cultures were so different. And in many cases, there are issues where, for example, we have different criteria for success. We had an issue, we wanted to have success defined by how many multi-author papers were there. And home departments would then say, we'd like to see how many single-author papers did a young professor have. And so one of the keys in any one of these things is that you have joint mentoring committees, if you have any kind of joint structures, that you not only educate the people in the departments who are being brought up, but the departments themselves kind of learn about each other through these processes. I think also the provosts of the universities in these cases have to be extraordinarily proactive about ensuring that the different cultures are respected, and that there's sort of buy-in from both sides on these things, and that there's a kind of an allowance for the fact that people are getting mixed signals from their different units and so on, and so that they need to find ways to kind of to move forward in that environment. To think about also valuing the fact that it could be that someone in a home department, let's say in computer science, is actually working with a disciplined scientist and publishes in a physics journal or an engineering journal or a coastal journal. They should be getting credit for that, not thinking that that doesn't count in their kind of promotion and tenure. And so there are many issues like that that have to be thought through very, very deeply. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think there's a lot that can be done there. But I think from the sort of the bully pulpit of NSF, we might be able to work with you all to come up with a set of best practices that help support this, and then provide funding that not only helps develop those best practices, but helps legitimize the interdisciplinary careers and helps develop the curricula for these things. And so, for example, when I'm talking about career awards in computational information sciences, I think that if you have people in your home departments who are working in these areas that I think are central to our future, but are kind of on the fringe of the traditional departments, then if we say, we will provide career awards in these areas, then the faculty who are working at the fringes will get that legitimacy of having a big NSF award that helps them survive in this kind of difficult world. So there are many aspects to this, but there are things I think we can do to align NSF and academic departments in a good way that will help resonate.
Thank you. There were a number of nods while you were talking there. The last question for you then, this is a question that I wrote, and I want to pose it to you because I have absolutely no idea what your answer is going to be. But we've been hearing a lot about the stimulus package recently, and we know that between the House and the Senate versions, there's between $1.2 and $3 billion in there for NSF, which is focused on NSF science, some of which presumably would go to you in the Office of Cyberinfrastructure. But also in the stimulus package is a lot of other infrastructure project work. I mean, they talk about shovel-ready infrastructure, and it's easy for a lot of people at the state level and local level to think about roads and to think about bridges and to think about railway lines and so on. And we've been having conversations, certainly at my institution, and I'm sure at several others, about what about cyber infrastructure. It is also infrastructure. It's absolutely critical to the future of this country. It also can generate economic development and jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And I was struck with the phrase that you had put up early in your presentation, the need to develop a coherent, integrated, high-performance cyber infrastructure from the campus to the national level. So my question to you is, has this been part of the discussion, sort of not as part of that scientific money, but have there been any discussions in Washington, between Washington and the states, about this? And is this an area where perhaps the campuses and NSF could engage in some discussion in fairly short order?
Yes, definitely yes. If I say any more than that, they'll shut down the connection here. But we're having discussions like this. I can't tell you how pleased I was that on Saturday the Senate version of the bill came out and the words cyber and infrastructure were next to each other. They weren't hyphenated, so the spell checker probably didn't like that, but they were actually there. And we're having discussions like this, so stay tuned. But this is very much in our minds.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So I'm going to make that our last question. I want again to thank you very, very much